I'm very glad to now know or have learned where Simon Bridges' inspiration for becoming a lawyer came from. It was the castle. And I think perhaps actually that fills a few gaps for me, so thank you for that. I do want to start off by saying that all of my colleagues have mentioned our appreciation over the level of consultation that has gone into the development of this bill, and I guess I would say long may it continue, because we have coming before us soon, one anticipates, some even more significant, probably in the grand scheme of things, electoral legislation which will impact on each and every one of us, but more importantly, impacts on the general public. And I think the Select Committee approached the analysis of this bill with two key objectives in mind, and really I think that probably unified our work, and that was the ultimate goal of transparency and the way that our electoral matters are conducted in New Zealand, and also the idea of public confidence. We approached all of our discussions with the idea of, does this instill confidence in the public that there are transparent, free and fair elections being undertaken in New Zealand? And I think we probably have reached that for this particular bill. I shall reserve judgment on any future legislation around transparency of donations. The thing that I want to dwell on the most, though, probably is what some of the other speakers have talked about, because I think from the submitter's perspective, they'll be most interested in how we decided to choose the entity type that we have to oversee electoral matters in New Zealand, and that is, of course, the new body of the Electoral Commission, which will be an independent Crown entity. So I want to dwell on the justification used by the Select Committee to settle on the Crown entity model, because as some of my colleagues have mentioned, very strong cases were put forward before us advocating that the new commission instead be an officer of Parliament. Now, it might seem from an outside perspective that's not a significant point of difference, but there were some differences. And so I do want to go over those. And I do also up front want to say that some of the submitters did have some scepticism that perhaps the Ministry of Justice had not provided us with an adequate breakdown of the rationale behind the Crown entity model. I just want to allay those concerns and say that if in the outset from their perspective it didn't seem like those justifications were provided, we certainly asked for them. As a committee, we certainly held the Ministry to task, and they certainly provided us with the information required to make this decision. A lot of persuasive arguments were made around the idea of the new Commission being an officer of Parliament, but ultimately the evidence produced by David McGee in particular was pretty compelling, and that's being touched on by my colleague, the Honourable David Parker. And from the outset, the committee had explained to it that, of course, the Finance and Expenditure Committee had already, in its business, determined the two criteria that need to sit around or have traditionally sat around the establishment of an Officer of Parliament, and the first being the requirement that an Officer of Parliament provide a check on the arbitrary use of power by the Executive. Now, we discussed at great length that the Electoral Commission's primary role would in fact be the responsibility of delivering quite a wide range of electoral services, but by and large, their key role would be the responsibility to deliver impartial and transparent elections in accordance with the law. I think when you contrast that with the role of an Officer of Parliament, perhaps like the Ombudsman, the Controller and Auditor General, and the Parliamentary Commissioner of the Environment, they have a much more direct scrutiny role of the Executive who may be in power at that particular time. And I think probably if you draw on some of the comment we've seen from an Officer of Parliament, you really see that coming to the fore. The Parliamentary Officer for the Environment, just this week, for instance, came out and presented a view on the government's proposals around mining. Quite a critical review. I think they called the government's proposals vague. I think there was also criticism around the cost-benefit analysis. Quite a slamming, damning report, I would have thought, from the Office of the Environment. So you really saw in that, I think, the key scrutiny role that an Officer of Parliament plays. And I think probably what we're looking for in the Electoral Commission is a much more functional role, a role that is involved in policy development and the like, and something that's probably quite different in our expectation. Also, if the Electoral Commission were established as an Officer of Parliament, that does mean that the Speaker then would be accountable to Parliament for its operation. And we do have to take in the practicalities of that and the role that the Speaker already has and the responsibilities in the House. And the Speaker has a number of responsibilities already overseeing the Office of the Clerk, the Office of the Ombudsman, the Office of the Controller and Auditor General, other officers of Parliament. It probably would be an unreasonable expectation to put such a weighty body under the arm of the Speaker. Not to mention that I think that there are some conflicts in that proposal in and of itself. So that additional accountability structure is something that we took into account in our decision making. We did also discuss the board structure of the Electoral Commission, and that as well would be a departure from the way the offices of Parliament exist. So I guess ultimately the Select Committee approaches from the perspective of what elements of the Officer of Parliament exist that these submitters are wishing us to carry over into the way that the Electoral Commission would operate if we could approach it from a different angle. And so we did make some changes to the legislation around the appointment process for people who would be on the board of the Electoral Commission to try and add some greater transparency, which I think submitters were seeking from us. I do want to just come back to one more point, though, because this again is a differentiation in the Crown entity model versus the Officer of Parliament. And that is that our expectation is that the new electoral agency would have a role in the development of policies related to electoral administration or an advisory role direct to the Minister regarding the administration of the Electoral Act and related legislation. Again, the example I already drew on from the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, I think shows the distinction between that very strong scrutiny role and the role that we expected, which was much more of a policy development one. Having said that, we did not want to create a situation where the Electoral Commission is not able to raise with a minister concerns or issues that may exist around the operation of our electoral law. So we did recommend inserting a new section which allows the Electoral Commission to provide information and advice to the Minister at any time and on their own volition. They don't have to be asked to provide that information. They can trigger that themselves. And also, for the sake of transparency, set out a process whereby the Electoral Commission can ensure that that information, if they so wish, is tabled within the House within a set time frame. I want to touch quickly on the membership of the Electoral Commission. We did have raised within the Select Committee a concern that inappropriate people, perhaps who demonstrated some bias, may be appointed to this really important body. And we had some people specifically submit that politicians, ex-politicians, should not be eligible for the board. To emphasise the independence of the board, we did recommend replacing Section 4D and in putting in place a new appointment process for the Electoral Commission, which involved the Governor-General on the recommendation of the House of Representatives. And I hope that that process will cover off any concerns that were raised with the Select Committee over the neutrality of the people being appointed to this body. I think when you involve members from across the House, you're more inclined to get that kind of outcome, and we demonstrate from time to time the ability to do that. All in all, I would like to finally, though, reiterate thanks to all of those who submitted and gave their expertise to the Select Committee, but just highlight once again the importance of, on an ongoing basis, the government continuing to consult with all parties in this House on the very important electoral reform that will come before us.